My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Kyle Bass, who I know a lot of the audience is a big fan of. But Kyle, for those who don't know your background, introduce yourself. Who are you? How'd you get interested, involved in markets? And what are you doing currently?
How much time do we have?
Yeah, exactly right.
No. Look, I've been in financial markets since 1992 on the sell side at Bear Stearns, Prudential, and Legg Mason. I launched a capital management firm in 2006 called Heyman, where we do global event-driven investing. And I've been a student of the world and world markets, and so I focus on global macro and geopolitics.
And a very proud American. I'm always a fan of the way.
And a very proud American, proud Texan, and proud American.
Exactly. So we're going to touch on kind of three main topics, three big areas here: G7 takeaways, hostage diplomacy, and Xi's march to war. So let's go with this kind of one by one here. Now, I've been traveling. I haven't really been tracking the news on G7 at all, but you made a point that there's the press coverage and then the reality of what's going on with the G7 summit. So first of all, for the audience, Kyle, lay out the audience. What's the significance of the G7 summit for global politics, the economy? I think most Americans probably aren't paying attention to it, but why should they?
I think if you look at what the press wrote about the G7 summit in Hiroshima, it was the 49th summit of the 7 leading economies in the world, except, of course, for China, and Russia was not involved either. But I think what's important is when you read the press takeaways, they all led with Joe Biden said that our relationship with China, our icy relationship with China, is set to, quote, thaw real soon, i.e. gave the market an expectation that there was something coming soon about, let's say, some sort of normalization of this ever-increasing friction that's going on between the middling kingdom of communism and the United States. What I found to be interesting about this is if you read the communique, and again, it's important to actually read what they say. The preamble was, we, the leaders of the G7, met in Hiroshima for our annual summit, May 19 through 21, more united than ever in our determination to meet the global challenges of the moment and set the course for a better future. Our work is rooted in respect for the Charter of the United Nations and international partnership. And then they kind of list 6 points as taking concrete steps on, number 1, supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes in the face of Russia's illegal war of aggression. Number 2, strengthening disarmament and non-proliferation efforts towards the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons with undiminished security for all. Number 3, coordinate our approach to economic resilience and economic security that is based on diversifying and deepening partnerships and de-risking, not decoupling. That's an important one. We'll come back to that. 4, drive the transition to clean energy economies for the future through cooperation with and beyond the G7. 5, launch the Hiroshima Action Statement for resilient global food security with partner countries that we need to address today and in the future. And the last one, deliver a goal of mobilizing $600 billion in financing for quality infrastructure through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. So when you look at the 6 together, it doesn't really, I guess, on the surface, look like they are organizing to say anything that had anything to do with the new Cold War or Cold War II. 5 of these 6 points are they're down the center of the fairway for Cold War II. The only one that doesn't really fit in the Cold War is driving the transition to clean energy economies for the future, although China emits more greenhouse gases than the entire developed world combined. So one could say that even that one is a message to China about getting its act together and having the rest of the G7 working against them there. But we're witnessing the formulation of a new organizing principle for international relations. Right? We're moving away from this global economy operating as one with globalism as everyone's, let's say, focused endpoint. And what we notice now is that rival blocs are forming they're developing, and they will actually determine the future of business and national security. And so you have China and Russia with their limitless partnership, and then you have other rogue states that have joined them, like Iran and North Korea. So you really have an axis of the bad guys or the people that have malign intentions globally. And the G7 is coming together to say, this is where we're going to focus. This is the new Cold War II, and we're here to meet the global challenges of the moment, which is how they led their preamble. And yet the press run with, oh, our relations with China are going to, quote, thaw real soon. Again, just it's a silly press takeaway if you actually read the document. So I think it's important to read things today. It's too we're all too focused on the headline and moving on. And I think the difference between the headline and what was really said are two different things, Michael. So I think it's important to talk about.
Yeah, and presumably the coverage in the U.S. is going to be very different than the coverage in Europe. I mean, you're not going to have the same kind of talking point in Europe about Biden as the lead.
Yeah, and look, one of the other things to mention is at the exact same time the G7 in Hiroshima got together, less well publicized, was outside of China, of course, was Xi's China Central Asia Summit. So Xi held a summit of the stands, the former Soviet republics of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and they traveled. Xi held this meeting at Xi'an, one of China's ancient capitals, and the historic origin starting point of the Silk Road. Again, very symbolic in its gesture, its meaning. For those that thought it was going to be a kind of multilateral get together of call it the C6. One notable exception that wasn't there, wasn't invited, was Russia, which is really interesting because these were all former Russian republics or Soviet republics, right? They are very, very heavily laden with rare earth minerals, lithium, and everything else that is necessary to kind of power the world and power China going forward or make them important. And Xi hosted, instead of a series of meetings that reinforced common understanding and commonality and equality, he held bilateral meetings and then solely issued its kind of speech at the end, its closing speech, about working together for a, quote, China Central Asia community with a shared future featuring mutual assistance, common development, universal security, and everlasting friendship. It probably sounded better when she said it, but this is just Xi announcing that the stands are vassal states to China. So again, very important symbolism on both sides of what just happened.
For the average American, is there any implication on day-to-day activities or things that need to be worried about as far as their family? I mean, again, all this matters from a very long-term perspective, right?
Yeah.
But talk about some of the implications on individuals, long-term.
I think, again, we'll get into the war. I'd like to just one thing that I think is topical and worth discussing before we move into how that affects people's lives at home is this concept of a quote silly balloon. The silly balloon comment has John Kerry written all over it, right? John Kerry cares about one thing, and it's climate change. And he's willing to mortgage today's capital and today's geopolitics for a 50-year pledge from a regime or group of regimes that have never lived up to their pledges. So when you hear about this balloon, right, this is a scenario where the Biden administration has all of the data as to what that balloon was doing, what the equipment did and was executing. And when you think about it, it was a data analytics machine that was collecting specialized data on atmospheric and altitude-based conditions and target detection for hypersonic weapons targeting that the Chinese are going to send at the U.S. in the event that we're in a real into call it kinetic conflict with China. It also had traditional surveillance gear. It had IMINT and SIGINT data. I'm just absolutely, I can't believe that the intelligence community is somehow justifying the classification of the photos. What this did was it told the whole world who China really is, right? This helped galvanize the call it gen pop of the United States and truly of the Western world as to China saying that it is a simple errant weather balloon that blew off course when we have all of the data to submit that it was absolutely put together to spy. The PRC knew what was in it. There's no mystery about how we came to access the contents, meaning sources and methods. So the only sensitivity here from the intelligence community would be political. There is no classification of any of this necessary, nor if it's challenged by a few committees in Congress, which I think it will be. Biden should have released all of this data long ago. But what it shows us, there is no justification for keeping this out of the American public. It's exactly the kind of thing that executive branch manipulation that gave Biden the ability to make this crazy statement. What's worst is that the rest of the world sees exactly what it is. It's Biden keeping things secret, trying to execute his administration's goals in secrecy instead of just letting the world determine who the bad guys are and who the good guys are. So I think that's in days to come, or days and weeks to come, we'll all understand exactly what that spy balloon was doing.
The other aspect of this is hostage diplomacy, which is a term I've heard but have never really thought of until you brought it up via DM to me. First of all, let's explain to the audience what in the world hostage diplomacy is and what is China doing with that.
Yeah, I mean, we all saw when we arrested Meng Wanwei, the CFO of Huawei, when we had her laptop showing Huawei shipments to Iran, to North Korea, to all of the places that we had primarily sanctioned, and Huawei was in not only in direct contravention. Huawei operates in the United States. She was in the United States. She was living in Canada, but she was here when we grabbed her. And what happened right away is China detained, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, which were two. I'm sure you guys have read about them, but they were two consultants working in. They were Canadian consultants. And they were just literally just grabbed as a counterweight to our indictment. We indicted Meng Wanwei. We had her. We asked Canada to grab her when they actually grabbed her. So she was in Canada, and so the Chinese grabbed two Canadians to hold as hostages, and they traded Spavor and Kovrig for Meng Wanwei. So it's important to note that the State Department has a travel advisory to China and Hong Kong. If you haven't read it, go to the State Department's website, look up China. It basically says there are extrajudicial incarcerations going on, i.e. just grabbing Americans and Westerners, and you won't be given consular or embassy access, and you may not be given the ability to have a lawyer present. So basically you're seeing arbitrary and capricious detentions of U.S. citizens and Canadian citizens, and they just grabbed a South Korean today. You just have to realize we've entered a new phase of the world, and the world isn't the way it used to be just a couple of years ago.
This is going to sound like a strange way to frame it, but is there a point where the number of people that's happening to suddenly rises to the top of the media's outlet and causes some real action by the U.S.? I mean, all this is happening, but you don't really hear about it too much on the local news.
Well, I mean, it's funny. The Chinese have media partnerships with almost the entire U.S. media in various ways and various joint ventures. They can actually change or let's say pull things out of the media. If you just look at Sherrod Brown, the Democratic congressman that's head of Senate banking, go to his Wikipedia page and look at the fact that a lot of both the Democrats and Republicans have been really pushing this media self-censorship being driven by China to censor and pull off the air anything that they don't want to see on the air. So I think it's really important to understand that the Chinese Communist Party has their grips into U.S. media, into Hollywood, into our educational institutions. So I think it's important to focus on that. China just sentenced a 78-year-old U.S. citizen to life in prison on spying charges. He's a permanent resident of Hong Kong. He was jailed on Monday. He was sentenced, right? He was jailed Monday. He was sentenced immediately, so that was last Monday. He was sentenced to life in prison. That guy's never going to see the outside of a prison again. He's 78 years old. Again, you're seeing these arbitrary detentions and kangaroo court sentencings. So imagine if you're a U.S. person, do you go? Do you risk being in China? If you have a business there, do you actually enter Hong Kong or China today? I'll just tell you, life has changed dramatically in the last year or two.
What about for Europeans? I mean, is China doing a similar actions with European citizens, or is it just centered around the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone has followed the when you need exit visas, and you're seeing more and more exit visas, being rejected, and it's actually really scaring people. And those are Europeans, South Koreans, so Southeast Asia, Europe, U.S. Yes, you're seeing this literally across the board. There have been a number of stories that have focused on this. Most recently, on May 2nd, there was a Reuters piece entitled "China's Exit Bans Multiply as Political Control Locks Down Under Xi." China is increasingly barring people from leaving the country, including foreign executives, which is a jarring message to those that are living and working in China from abroad. Scores of foreigners have been ensnared by exit bans, according to a report by the human rights group Safeguard Defenders, while a Reuters analysis has found a surge of court cases involving exit bans in recent years. So again, this is really important to pay attention to. So anyway, yeah, the answer is yes. It's kind of worldwide, and you have to be very careful what you say, what you do, and you probably saw they just updated their espionage laws that say if you're gathering business intelligence on the business that you're in or your competitors, that can be deemed to be a national secret, and you can be arrested under national security laws. The data collection for macro level data and corporate level data was severed to the West about a month and a half ago. So there's no more. It was geo blocked. So there's no more Wind. There's no more CEIC. I don't know if you guys use any of these databases, but those databases are no longer available. So China's going into a lockdown, which of course leads me to that question you asked me about what's happening. China is preparing for war. Since January of 2020, there are many obvious things that China's done. There's three buckets that you think about war and how we think about analyzing how they're operating. One is the force posturing side, so think about the military side, and that's something that Western allied militaries are very good at tracking, following, and understanding what's going on with the PRC's military. The second bucket is on the mainland in China. What is China doing in their so-called legal system, or what are they doing in preparation for, call it, next moves on the kinetic scoreboard in the world? And the third thing is what are they doing financially that either would indicate that they're not about to move in the kinetic sphere, or that they are going to? And our expertise is, of course, the financial sphere, but in all three of those buckets, they all point in one direction, and China is moving rapidly towards an invasion of Taiwan. And what does that mean for all of us? Well, that means that if we get into severe sanctions with China, our sanctions with Russia are really just Swiss cheese. We never touched Russia's energy business writ large. We never touched the banks. We literally did almost nothing to Russia on the sanctions side. We sanctioned 10% of the oligarchs, big deal. We sanctioned a couple of their banks that aren't that meaningful. We didn't touch 2/3 or 3/4 of their economy. So Russia is no model for what we'll do with China. Taiwan is much more important. So anyway, I think you'll see on their financial preparation, on their force posturing preparation, and you see on their legal preparation, all of it's pointing in the same direction.
And yet, a lot of the semiconductor stocks have gone vertical, and markets are supposed to be discounting mechanisms, right? I mean, at some point, you have to assume that, let's call it in quotes, the smart money would see that coming and suddenly start to pull a lot of money out of Taiwan in particular. If I'm right on that, why hasn't that started? Why is the momentum still so overwhelming in favor of semis and chips and anything that really comes out of Taiwan?
Well, you probably noticed that Warren Buffett liquidated his entire position in TSMC and announced it, a couple of weeks ago. So, one would say that he's some smart money. I would say that, TSMC makes the most advanced chips in the world. For those of you that know tech, they make 2 nanometer chips in Taipei. We, through Intel, think we can make a 7 nanometer chip, but Taiwan Semi's building a couple of facilities in Phoenix. One's a 5 nanometer facility, one's a 3. So we're trying to put the U.S. and the West into a position where, in the event of an invasion or worse, a war, we would have access to some of the more advanced chips to keep life going the way it has been going. This will be a pretty significant and abrupt stop in many areas of life. Number one, at home, you won't be able to have access to antibiotics, right? 95% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in antibiotics are made in Wuhan. Somehow we allowed that frog to boil very slowly until it was too late. And now we are actively trying to reshore some of those pharmaceuticals. Again, that's not rocket science. That's just blocking and tackling. 100% of the blood pressure medicine that 800,000 Americans take every single day is made in Wuhan. A lot of the world's ibuprofen. So when you look at children's Tylenol, children's Advil, made in China. So I think from a perspective of, you won't have a new iPhone for a while, and you won't have access to medicines, and it'll be difficult, but we will get through it. We will, what the West does so beautifully is adapt. Our supply chain movement has been slow, but deliberate, and those that are slow playing it or not moving will end up losing everything, in my opinion. And those that move quickly will be rewarded for doing so. I think, again, Michael, it's a very small percentage of participants end up getting these big turns right. We sit at a hinge in history, and people better start paying attention.
Oh, I don't. There's no question about that, right? It's just interesting to me that you have that backdrop, and the narrative is, push these semi stocks up because AI is going to take over the world, and it may end up being that China tries to take over the world instead. Which is sort of the way things work.
Yeah, it's again, it is a really difficult question because the only historical analog I have for you is, if you remember, shortly after the outbreak of the virus that emanated from Wuhan, we had a scenario where the Trump administration was about to announce a presidential commission organized to study the origins of the virus. And if you go back and you look at what happened, we announced that we were going to make the announcement of the formation of this presidential commission. And within 2 hours' time, the Chinese spokesperson, the official Chinese spokesperson, came out and gave or put this out on Twitter and said, to the extent that the U.S. even launches a presidential commission on the origins of the virus, we will immediately withhold antibiotics. They literally said it in a press release, and that killed it. We actually demurred. We backed away, and the National Security Council, considered calling China's bluff there, but President Trump, despite what we all have heard about him, he was not a strong, let's say, leader against China. He fought the National Security Council tooth and nail every time they wanted to do something to defend ourselves against the Middling Kingdom. So I've only seen that happen once. It came within a 2-hour window of our announcement. And, in this case, we have to be ready. And look, we've been working for a few years now on reshoring these things. And again, those of you that know pharmaceuticals and you understand the difference between a biologic and and an Orange Book, drug. Uh, it's again not rocket science, but we need a little bit of lead time to get it done, and we're working hard on getting it done right now. I had the benefit of meeting Tsai Ing-wen, having dinner with her before her Hudson Institute appearance when she was in New York. And she is, A, an amazing woman, B, she's actually funny in a personal setting, and she is extremely strong and knows what needs to get done. It wasn't necessarily that they didn't like what our proposal was in an incredibly surprising fact of that meeting in New York was Taiwan is asking for a tax treaty with the United States on our engagement with them on semis. Believe it or not, there's a double tax involved, and this is something that should have been done with the wave of a wand. We agreed to do so during our visit here, but there were structural impediments that made absolutely no sense that no one had paid attention to until her visit to the U.S. So I think you're going to see, you're going to see an immediate normalization and let's just say highest and best use architecture put in. The real key is the engineers required to operate a 2 nanometer facility are only in Taiwan. They are the world's best. As you know, between TSMC and ASML in Holland, between photolithography and the advanced chips at TSMC, they make the substantial majority of all the important chips. But I think that, look, we've been working on that 5 nanometer facility for TSMC in Phoenix. Those of you live in Phoenix or can pull up on Google the cranes. I've never seen more cranes in my life, but we've been working on that project in the U.S. since 2017. That was a Secretary Pompeo directive where we fast-tracked that, moved it through our government in record speed, and we are close to having that 5 nanometer facility together, and the 3 nanometer facility is going. Mind you, these are $18 billion buildings. They are huge. They require clean rooms, as you know. So it just takes time. And every day that goes by gets us one day closer to self-sustainability, which means China has a distinct advantage moving sooner rather than later. It sounds like you understand the Turkic dominance more than, let's just say, better than I do. What I know about Turkey is they're not a real friend of the West, right? Erdogan is really a ruthless dictator in his own right. He supported ISIS. He supported many of the terrorist groups right under his wing, and allowed them to invest in the Turkish economy. And so when I think about the Turkic Council and the stands, and we saw what happened with Afghanistan as soon as we left, it's really just. I mean, when you really understand what's happening there, it's warlords overseeing their own fiefdoms, and they end up very resource-rich countries with very poor constituencies, which is a bit like Africa. But when you look at China's move there, I think about how basically it looks to me like what you're seeing China do is they're starting to kind of act like the Bolsheviks, right? The Communist Party is playing the role of the Bolsheviks, and basically they're just creating vassal states and satellites to protect them. And the way that the stands work is you just pay them, to your point. So it also really affects that China's relationship with Moscow if what they're doing is moving in on former Soviet republics. The China-Russia partnership they're very strange bedfellows. One has a desperate need for natural resources and a huge population, and one has a substantial abundance of natural resources and a dying population. They know that they don't trust each other. They know that their partnership is only to counter the West for this moment in time. And in the end, Russia knows it's going to be a vassal state of China. And so I just think this is China moving in that era of just natural resource acquisition and paying for it. And really, that's all I think is happening. And well, as you know, Canada has really, you're right, that basically Canada allowed China to take over. I mean, we all know, we all joke that Vancouver is the Beijing of the West. But I think that you have a scenario where Canada has actually realized, and you've seen a bunch of mainstream media press articles about Canada pushing back against the infiltration of China into their political sphere and actually into influencing their elections, right? Um, so anyway, I think that Canada's on this, and the U.S. and our intelligence agencies have been helping Canada a lot, understanding that China has been interfering in their elections. You know, I'm sure you saw in early March or mid March, Trudeau, was talking about how basically China has interfered in Canadian elections. So again, I think it's coming to light, and I think they're moving. Canada's moving to try to root out the infiltrations of their political sphere, and that's just going to take time. Yeah, no, listen, the big gap is Wall Street, right? Wall Street has almost 12% of its revenue derived from China. China has owned the big investment banks and therefore has lined straight into the U.S. Treasury. They're very important when you look at the passive indices. Here you've got between MSCI EM, MSCI World, and the Bloomberg Lehman aggregate bond indices. We think that you've seen about $1.2 trillion of passive capital go in. On the FDI numbers that have been reported, in total, we think it approaches $3 trillion of FDI. So to your point, if you think they're just trying to manage the situation at home, their banking system is almost 4 times levered to their GDP. Their banks are infinitely more leveraged than U.S. banks. They have about 40% of the asset mix of their banks is real estate between mainland China and a bit of Hong Kong, and that real estate's down anywhere from 20 to 30% from its highs. So they've already, in reality, they have a banking crisis going on, and you've probably seen the most recent articles in the last couple of weeks have shown that youth unemployment's now hit 20%. So the people getting out of school have nowhere to go. They have no jobs. And that is a death sentence for Xi Jinping if he lets the economic wheels continue to roll the way they're rolling. And I think that it's gaining. The snowball is getting larger and larger as it rolls down the hill on the economy side. So what you're seeing him do by again severing all corporate macro level data flows just a month and a half ago. If what he's trying to do is increase the dollar flow in, to your point, on the debt side or the equity side, he would be telling a great story. And in fact, he's going the other way, which is actually pretty scary. If he was trying to attract capital, first of all, how does a fiduciary discount Xi Jinping risk? How do you discount the risk of no audits? How do you discount variable interest entities, which, as you know, all of the Chinese ADRs are just fantasy football shares. You don't have a claim to anything in China. And now we knew that we had, let's say, low fidelity data, but now we have no data. How do you discount no data? So I get to the point where that gap between Wall Street and let's just say basic logic is the widest I've ever seen it. And fiduciaries are actually abrogating their fiduciary responsibilities by staying invested in China. To your point, I don't care whether it's 4% of the portfolio or in the case of MSCIM, it's 43% of MSCIEM. You've got to get out before the doors close. There is no marginal or let's say incremental upside for taking the enormity of the additional risks you're taking with no rule of law, no audits, Xi Jinping risk, all the things I just went through. They're absolutely, you'd much rather have a Western market, whether it's Canada, whether it's the US, whether it's Europe. You'd much rather be invested somewhere where you actually have a claim to assets, where you have a rule of law, or at least much better rule of law than exists in China, or as China is ruled by law. So your question's good, but this concept of him maybe saber rattling and doing all of these things in the three buckets I discussed, if you listen to Xi Jinping's speeches since 2017 and you listen to him, not the takeaways from the Western media, he tells you unambiguously he is taking Taiwan, whether they like it or not. This is like a spouse who refuses to accept a divorce. You're welcome. I've challenged, just to follow up on that, I've challenged some of the world's top CIOs on that point. And the overwhelming response I get from, let's say, these are top 20 endowment and pension managers in the US, I always get, they're the world's second largest economy. How do we not invest there? That's the answer. And I look at them and say, if that's your rationale for investing there, I can't believe you have investors.
But by the way, I will say that there is money that clearly is moving away from China, and that's actually a good transition to Perth Toll, who I brought in as a speaker. And Perth, I got to give you a lot of credit. I was not aware of this because, candidly, I'm overwhelmed with so many things. But Weisskopf had mentioned to me that you're nearly at $500 million on your ETF, which is designed to try to prevent investors from going into the wrong parts of the world. So I give you a lot of credit. You really grinded for a while, and you've got some big success. So congrats to you, Perth.
Well, Perth, I agree with you, and I think that here's another really interesting data point. One of my friends that teaches at West Point's War College came out of DoD and is very focused on a lot of the issues, Perth, that you're focused on, I'm focused on. And he wanted to launch an ETF that was basically the U.S. technology ex-China index. And he had a $50 million seed investor. He had everything going perfectly, and he was trying to get it rated. I don't know whether it was S&P or Moody's, who said that they were going to give him a rating on the just 10 to 14 days before the eve of launch. And at the very last minute, the ratings agencies came to him and said, "We can't rate you." And he said, "Why not?" He says, It has clearly upset some of our other rating, our other ETFs that we rate, and they pay us more, and we can't do it. It would affect our business." So it literally shut him down. Which, as you know, will be Hernandez and MSCI and the crew. That doesn't see these indices that, by the way, if you backtest the indices like yours against, let's just say, MSCI writ large or world indices, you outperform. He would outperform. When you focus on a U.S. European led tech index ex China, it dramatically outperforms anything with China in it. Yeah, and to your point, that's over a very long period of time. Even if you want to shorten that, go back to, say, 2008. If you invested in the Shenzhen 300 or in the S&P, the Shenzhen 300, your Shenzhen 300 investment is down 30% from 2008 to today, and the S&P is up almost 400%, including dividends. And you have a rule of law. You have everything that you have here, the most liquid, deepest capital markets. You have all of the great things here. There is no incremental return for all of the additional risks you're taking. There's no how you cut it. It just doesn't happen.
And for being an entrepreneur, by the way, Perth, like I said, I give you a lot of credit. It's the ETF industry. When you're mark to market, FinTwit does not appreciate or understand this, but when you're in the business of launching products and you're mark to market daily, and you've got to fight against cheap beta and survive the very high cost of running an ETF, what you've done is an incredible success story. So, like I said, congrats to you.
Yeah, it is a good question. I just, when you look at again, Brazil, Russia, China, India, let's just say core BRICS. When you have a reserve manager and you have someone that has, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of capital, there are very few places that you can, I guess, invest that capital. You said gold. What is there so far? Maybe $7 trillion worth of gold, maybe eight that have ever been mined in the history of the world. When you look at global broad money, I would say Global M2 is somewhere around $100 trillion, right? I guess somewhere in there. So you have a scenario where there are very few places deep enough to put that money. Now, when you're talking about the call it coalition of the countries of malign intent or the axis of evil, when you're talking about Russia and China's limitless partnership, and then you start talking about Iran and North Korea, and then you get into the states that will have to play the middle, and that takes you to India, that takes you to Saudi Arabia, that takes you to UAE, the places that will have to stay somewhere in the middle to the extent that they can. Uh, you know, everyone forgets China has a closed capital account. If China allowed its people to freely leave, I mean, what real country has to wall both their people and their capital in? There isn't one except China, and one would say that, it's a Marxist-Leninist, uh, autocracy or totalitarian government. So again, they have a closed capital account. No one trusts the Chinese government. No one trusts the fidelity of their data. No one trusts the amount of currency in circulation. And clearly, they've been moving around the world. If Xi was about to invade Taiwan, China imports is the largest importer in the world of crude oil and LNG. They import about 11.5 million barrels a day of crude, about 8 BCFs of LNG every day. They would, if he was about to do this, you'd see him flying to Saudi Arabia. Oh, for the first time in the history of the world, Xi Jinping, a Chinese leader, set foot in Saudi Arabia. What was interesting about that too is on December 7th. December 7th is a really important day for the United States. Anyway, I would say that what they're trying to do is set up a system of barter amongst the bad guys. Uh, will that suffice to be a quote global reserve alternative? Imagine investing in the coalition of the malign countries. I can't imagine it if I was a reserve manager. So does it mean that the dollar won't have the full dominance that it has today? Absolutely. Cross-border transactions today are still high 80% range for dollars. That only has one way to go over time, and it's down. But that doesn't mean the dollar will lose its dominance anytime soon. If in fact the world bifurcates into good guys, bad guys, and straddlers, which is, by the way the world order is headed right now, then so be it. Okay. Well, Neely, I think from the one of the callers earlier today, we were talking about pharmaceutical production and specifically APIs of antibiotics. There are places for real leadership in our country. Meaning, if we say at our firm, if U.S. national security was left to the private sector, we'd all be speaking Chinese tomorrow. So it's important for us to take steps to protect our security. You mentioned food security. We were talking about pharmaceutical security. There are a number of things that we should be doing from the top of the United States to say we must set government mandates for minimum amount of production of pharmaceuticals onshore, and we must have a strategic stockpile. Someone's got to do that. Someone with half a brain should do that right now. And same goes for many other things in our country that we can't just let the private sector figure out on their own. So there are a few things we need to do strategically. When you talk about food security, you have to remember the U.S. is actually the Saudi Arabia of food. We are unbelievably lucky, geographically speaking, to be where we are, to have the abundancy of resources we have on the water, land, and arable land side. So I'm very comfortable with where we are in food. China, on the other hand, has to import 40% of its food every single day. In Xi's last speech at the two sessions, he said we need to get the rice bowl firmly grasped in our hands, i.e., he's got to figure out how to make a lot more food or contract to buy a lot more food from bad guys if he in fact is going to become militaristically belligerent. On our side, the world has a problem with access to fresh water and clean, potable fresh water. The U.S. actually has in certain areas has a superabundance of groundwater, and in other places has none. I think we are innovative enough to figure out our water problems. You probably know that there are only 10 states in America that run under rule of capture, which means if you buy the surface you buy surface land, you own the groundwater. Texas happens to be one of those states. The rest of the states, the other 40 states in the U.S., the state owns the water. So we will get some industrial engineering going, and we will figure out the water problem. In fact, President Biden said something about Colorado river water conservation. I believe today or yesterday, my team had sent me an email, and I hadn't read it yet. But anyway, we're focused in the right areas on food and water in America. There are many places around the world that have a desperate need to acquire food, and they're much worse shape than we are. So, Neely, my answer is I think we're in pretty good shape.
I think that's a good place to wrap this Twitter space up. Everybody, please make sure you follow Kyle Bass. Aside from Twitter, Kyle, any other places that people can get involved with some of the things that you think about or content you put out?
Twitter's a great spot.
Fair enough. I'll have this as an edited podcast under Lead Lag Live, folks. Everybody enjoy the rest of your evenings wherever you are. Thank you, Kyle. Appreciate it.
Sure. Take
Cheers,
care.
everybody.
Bye-bye.